The Homestead Act of 1862 promised opportunity to some, but for others, it marked the beginning of profound loss. This is the story of a nation shaped by dreams and disrupted by displacement.
In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act and created a world of opportunity for some 372,000 families that poured onto the prairies. They came for many reasons: a hunger for land, a vision for the future, a longing for adventure, and interest in profit. Some failed, some scraped by, some succeeded, and in the process put down roots that changed this land forever. It was called the Great American Desert, a wasteland, a barrier to be crossed on the way to the Pacific coast. The flat, treeless prairie was some of the most fertile land on the continent, yet to early explorers accustomed to thickly forested landscapes, the land looked worthless. To others, the vast prairies of the Midwest offered a chance to achieve the working-class dream of land ownership and economic independence.
Be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any person who is the head of a family or who has arrived at the age of...
At the height of the Civil War, passage of the Homestead Act brought an end to decades of bitter controversy over federal land policy. The act at last achieved what so many had worked so long for, ensuring that it was not just the rich and powerful who would claim the unbroken plains, but anyone willing to work to achieve their dream of becoming landowners.
Upon which said person may have filed a preemption claim.
All of this was part of a general philosophy of the Republican Party, but especially of Abraham Lincoln, which has been called the right to rise, the free labor ideology, a dynamic kind of democratic capitalism, and the opportunity for farmers to take up 160 acres of land and to develop that land very much fit in with this philosophy, which was at the core, I think, of Lincoln's ideology. Give everybody an opportunity, and then if they work hard, they'll get ahead and they'll develop America.
March 1st, 1884. Dear old friends, you speak of going to Nebraska. Let me say to you that Nebraska is a nice country, but the government lands are about all taken there. I came to Dakota 3 years ago last fall with Mr. Wilder. We liked it then, and we still like it. I could start from my very door and mow a straight 100 miles if I choose. The same with breaking no stumps, no roots, with very few stones to interfere in any way. The soil's good, and it makes a fella feel good to get good crops. A homestead or tree claim costs first on entry $14, and at time of proof of residence costs $4 more, making $18 for 160 acres. Is this cheap enough for you? If so, pull up stakes and come to Dakota as soon as you can. When you are about ready to start, write me, and I will tell you where to land here. Newcomers are arriving here to get a slice of Uncle Sam's domain. And what other folks can do, why, with patience cannot you. Only keep this rule in view. Come to Dakota and begin anew. J.G. Towley.
The primary reason people came out to the Great Plains was because of land. The Land Acts during the 1800s provided free land or greatly reduced cost land to the people who came out. And at the time, the United States and the world was an agrarian society. And so land ownership meant economic enhancement, it meant power, it meant a future for your family. So the vast majority of people came out to seize on the opportunities that free land presented to them.
When I began to research my great-grandfather, I didn't know very much about him. Joseph Marquardt, the wheat king of Logan County, I knew those few facts about him, that somehow between 1886, when he fled Russia and landed in Dakota Territory, and in the 1930s when he died, he managed to accumulate almost 6,000 acres of land. Well, inevitably you have to say, how did he do that? My great-grandfather left because he got involved in a little altercation with a commanding officer, and he was secretly taken out under cover of darkness. When they came to the Dakota Territory and got oxen carts and then made their way north to this completely unbroken landscape. Apparently my great-grandfather's response to it was just complete awe, amazement, excitement, just exhilaration. He saw what he would make of it. He saw a kind of a completely blank canvas that he could just build a life on.
Lincoln and supporters of the Homestead Act realized the vast tracts of land in the Great Plains could not support settlers if the only way to ship goods was by ox cart and wagon. It would take high-speed, dependable transport. It would take the railroads.
In addition to the Homestead Act, Lincoln also signed the Pacific Railroad Act, which made land grants to railroads to build across the continent. That's for economic development, tying the whole nation together.
The federal government realized transcontinental railroads were crucial to economic development, political cohesion as a nation, and all the rest. The problem was when the charters for these transcontinental railroads were awarded, we were at war. Lincoln's government was cash poor. They were spending all the money to fight the Confederate States during that conflict. But they were land rich, so they decided to award land grants to railroads as an inducement to build west, the Northern Pacific, which received alternating sections of 160 acres, kind of a checkerboard pattern on each side of the line, nearly 50 million acres from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound.
A great deal of boosterism. The railroads especially, they had their agents in Scandinavia and in Germany. They tied up with steamship companies, so somebody could buy a ticket, one ticket, that would get them across the Atlantic and then on the railroad to wherever they were going to go.
Thanks to aggressive marketing by both the government and the transcontinental railroads, lands opened up by the Homestead Act drew settlers in unprecedented numbers.
My dad's name was Arnie Thorsted, and mother was Hilda. They came to this country in 1903. My oldest sister was born in Norway. She was 3 months old when they came over. How they decided to come to North Dakota, I have no idea, but I suppose it was homesteading. If you weren't the oldest son, you had to get out. That was the way it was over there. They came. A lot of people came at that time, you know. When my aunt and uncle came, it was in the fall. It was so rough, and they were so sick. So it makes a difference what time of the year, I think. When my folks came, it was in May. Mother said the water was just barely a ripple, you know. She said her and Dad danced all the way over here. They loved to dance. That was the best time of her life.
Between 1878 and 1890, the non-Indian population of the Great Plains would skyrocket from 16,000 to more than 191,000.
Northern Pacific, for example, had an entire land department devoted to selling plots of land to induce settlers to arrive from Germany and other parts of Europe to come west, to build family farms, to take advantage of the Homestead Act and other pieces of legislation to settle the land, if you will.
There was a brochure that was put out I believe it was simply called Dakota, that is sent to inquiring folks for a penny postcard, and they get this brochure, their comments about the health of this particular region, that the cold air actually kills off all miasma, all bad air, that the land is beautiful enough to cause the angels to stop mid-flight in the sapphire skies, to look down upon the land and wonder if a new Eden had not been formed, where the farmers wear diamond stick pins in their collars and anybody can make a living on a quarter section. And if you're living in Scandinavia, farming 4 acres, 5 acres, this has to sound wonderful.
The marketing campaign in Europe was wildly successful. By the time of the 1890 census, 1 out of every 3 North Dakotans was born in a foreign country.
Behind us, that was the original George Schreiber homestead and house built here in the 1890s. What got him is the railroad's story of free land, telling him how fertile it was and so on. The railroads had great PR persons. You have to consider what they left. Conditions were not good over there either. They both came from the Alsace-Lorraine territory originally, as the wars would just keep going back and forth. And when they heard free land in the United States, well, after all, if the guy back here is shooting at you and the gate's open over there, you might as well head for the open gate.
I think they did anticipate that this would encourage immigration. And in fact, immigration had been a central part of American life through most of the adult lives of these people. I think most Americans were very much in favor of immigration at that time, immigration of what they considered to be desirable peoples. And not everybody was considered by everyone else to be desirable, but that's another issue. Lincoln was certainly pro-immigrant. I think they did anticipate that this would help to develop the country, to fill up the empty spaces in the West.
It wasn't just experienced farmers who came west to claim a homestead. It was also railroad workers, shopkeepers, farmhands, school teachers, bankers, doctors, lawyers, even mail-order brides.
For 10 years, we had no neighbors to the north of us except the antelope visited us now and then. The first human visitors were Indians. Never before had I seen Indians. These came for several summers to make their appearance and hunt. Not far from our house, they set up their tent, and we must say this for the Redskins. They were more ambitious than we. Frau Louisa Winkler.
It did not seem to matter in the least to supporters of the Homestead Act that the lands about to be given away were, in fact, already populated.
Before homesteading could occur, there had to be some way of taking the Indian title from them. Settlers were, in many cases, clamoring to get in, and a few of them, of course, had anticipated and had moved across the Red River and began to, in effect, squat or set up places that they thought were on national land. And of course, most of it, the title was still part of Indian land.
As a result of the Fort Laramie Treaties and the Dawes Act of 1887, the government seized title to millions of acres of Indian lands.
The United States did see all of this as a way of getting Indians out of the way and of making land available to real Americans. And in fact, you often hear that phrase, real Americans. And Indians were simply not going to be allowed to stand in the way.
Quarter section by quarter section, railroad and government lands began to attract homesteaders. At first just a trickle, but soon a flood. The Homestead Act made it possible for many disenfranchised people to finally own land. Women, freed slaves, immigrants, urban poor, even eventually Confederate soldiers. But one group was not permitted to file a homestead claim: Native Americans.
In 1888, the government wanted us to quit living in teepees and to build log houses. Up to this time, we were healthy and strong, but after that, many became sick and weak. The government gave each Indian family 5 to 10 head of cattle. We got along nicely. All the Indians had cattle and horses. After the reservation was opened up to white people in 1915, the government and the white people soon forced us out of the cattle business. The government encouraged us to lease or sell our cattle and horses. We no longer did any work, and hard times came upon us.
Following the 1862 Dakota conflict, starvation among the Dakota Indians on the Santee Reservation in Nebraska led a determined group to force the government to examine that prohibition.
Many of the Dakota were Christians. So at one point, 24 families from Santee Reservation, Christian families, just got up and moved, along with their minister, up to the area of what is now Flandreau, South Dakota. And they just settled there. They said they weren't going to go back to Santee because people died there. And they were trying to become farmers, and they were trying to be civilized, they were trying to be good Christians. And the question arose, can they homestead? And there was a big debate that went back and forth in the Dakotas as well as in Congress and at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the issue was Indians weren't people. They had no standing in law. So how could they possibly file on a homestead? Even though, of course, we would let foreigners do it. Eventually, somebody finally said, why don't we just be logical? We want them to assimilate, don't we? And so they allowed them to take homesteads if they agreed to give up being Indian, that they would have to renounce their tribalism. 23 or 24 people went to Yankton, which was then the capital, and filed agreeing to give up their Indian citizenship and to just be like other Americans. They filed around Flandreau. They became taxpayers, private property owners. So you had the curious thing of Indians taking advantage of the act and the United States deciding that they were people. One of the reasons they were allowed to do that is because some of the non-Indians, the German Russians in the area, who had been homesteading already, said they really wanted the Dakota to be their neighbors. They were good neighbors. In fact, they were way better than the Norwegians.
By the early 19th century, the U.S. was rapidly growing, both in size and power. Land-hungry and ambitious, the new country was also drastically changing its policies towards the Indian nations. And nowhere was this more evident than in the treaties.
The United States' primary interest in treaty making was to acquire Indian land. And so the treaties were used for that purpose, especially as the United States found itself in a position to pretty much dictate the terms of the treaty. And so the treaties morphed from this friendship and reciprocity sort of relationship into a very one-sided thing.
There's almost a mythology about this, that somehow when the Pilgrims arrived, they were dragging land behind them. There was no land brought here. The land here was Native nations. And this is what the United States needed. It's what it wanted. They wanted all of it. They wanted everything.
The greed came in. Well, we have a little tract here now we need a little more. And, well, we need to go make another treaty. We didn't understand that eventually those treaty-making processes ended up to the acquisition of all of our ancestral homeland. That land was a part of us. That land helped us be. That land was who we were and who we are.
The command of removal came unexpectedly upon most of us. There was a time that we noticed several overloaded wagons were passing our home, yet we did not grasp the meaning. Then one day, wagons stopped. We were to be taken away and leave our homes, never to return.
To get what they wanted, U.S. officials brokered treaties through any means available. Their tactics were so corrupt that the once trusted treaties became quickly known as bad paper.
There were people at these treaty negotiations who would do anything to get an agreement on the table. And so there was very routinely bribery, individual payments made to tribal leaders. Alcohol would be used to put people in an agreeable frame of mind, and even coercion to say to people, you must sign this agreement or else.
Every means of trickery and fraud was employed against Native nations. The United States would appoint a false leadership, people who had no right to speak for the tribe, and say, you're the leader of this tribe, sign this paper giving away all your land.
As the century progressed, the treaties became more and more lopsided, a far cry from the parallel paths of the Goswenta. Despite appeals from the Indian nations, the U.S. kept on its new trajectory, rationalizing its aggressive actions along the way.
They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement. The tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness.
It's important in the great American mythology to describe the Americas as wilderness. Because of its wilderness, then there's really nobody to dispossess. It was okay to come here and prosper and conveniently forget that there were already people and civilizations in place.
At first we had something to eat, but that gave out and we were starving. We came to a slippery elm tree and ate the bark of that. Lots took sick and died.
As Americans successfully pushed the bounds of the frontier, they not only believed that they were destined to take over the land and prosper, they believed that God was the one who put them there to do it.
They believed that it was God's will, that the United States should be a continental nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As each wave of immigration would come, they'd move into an area. The United States would then make some sort of arrangement with the tribe to get that land from them. And then more would come, and they'd advance the frontier even further.
The power of manifest destiny, of expansion, of inevitability, of God's providence helped to rally people around not only the idea of Americans as entitled to North America, but rallied them around the idea that Indian people were barriers to civilization and barriers to progress.
No matter how many treaties were signed or how much land they gave to the United States, the Indian was still in the way. This was known as the Indian problem. This so-called problem continued despite a decades-old policy to force Indians to swap their land east of the Mississippi for land west of it. The Indians would then move to those western parts and away from the Americans. This plan was simply called removal.
The Removal Act was the centerpiece of Andrew Jackson's political agenda, and it was very controversial at the time. It was very widely debated. There was lots of discussion across the country, and very many prominent people spoke up against it.
Will the American government steal? Will it lie? Will it kill? I have no desire to see the poor remnants of a once powerful people. The removal bill represents oppression with a vengeance.
The removal process, it was, all right, you've made these treaties. Now, you can have one of two things. You can keep your sovereignty, but you can't keep your land. But if you keep your land, then you have to assimilate and no longer be Indian. You will have sovereignty or you have your land. You can't have both.
Across the United States, the Removal Act divided the country. But across the Indian nations, reaction was unanimous.
We are surrounded by white people, and there are encroachments made. What assurances have we that similar ones will not be made on us should we remove to the Mississippi? Look here, Father. Our lands belong to us. We shall keep them. We do not wish to talk to you anymore.
We had already been fighting to keep that land. And sure enough, when the government was coming in there to take us out of that land, we fought even more. But at some point, you have to realize that this fighting is all going to be about death. And death is coming. Then I need to be protecting my family, and I want my children to survive. So we have to endure this removal.
Many of the tribes did choose to accept removal as a means of maintaining the tribal nation. What choice was there? After decades of engagement, they could no longer resist. And so they gave up their lands, they gave up their homes, they gave up their fields and forests, they gave up literally their way of life in order to be able to stay together and be what they were.
We are poor, but we are free. No white man controls our footsteps.
Some try to assimilate to avoid removal. Some were removed completely. But in the end, every nation met the same fate. Every nation had to give up land.
Brothers, you cannot remain where you are now. You have but one remedy within your reach, and that is to remove to the west. May the Great Spirit teach you how to choose.
The loss of land was devastating, and so was the loss of lives. The most famous of these incidents was the Cherokee Nation's Trail of Tears, but there were numerous other trails just as violent and just as crushing.
In the face of such violence, many Southern blacks sought opportunities out west. The 1862 Homestead Act provided a 160-acre plot of western federal land to those who would settle and farm on it for at least 5 years. However, not all of those lands were open to black settlers. Of the states that allowed black homesteading, Kansas was the closest to the old Confederacy. Black migrants who came to be known as exodusters seized upon this opportunity to escape the white supremacist regime of the post-Reconstruction South. Benjamin Pap Singleton, a former slave born in Nashville, Tennessee, became a leader of the Exoduster movement. In later years, he became known as the father of the Exodus. By 1874, Singleton and his associates formed the Edgefield Real Estate and Homestead Association in Tennessee, which steered more than 20,000 black migrants to Kansas between 1877 and 1879. In 1878, Benjamin Singleton himself led a party of 200 settlers to Kansas. During the 1870s and early 1880s, 25,000 black migrants sought refuge in Kansas with the hopes of establishing a plot of land on their own black towns free from the tyranny of the Jim Crow South. Nicodemus, Kansas was the best known of these black communities. However, despite the free land, black migration across the Mississippi was no small task, and life on the frontier was hard living. The first settlers had little farm equipment and faced drought, prairie fires, crop failures, and grasshopper swarms. Williana Hickman was one of the first settlers to reach Nicodemus on the western plains of Kansas. She traveled with 140 other colonists on a trip that began March 3, 1878, and left the following account of her journey. We left for Nicodemus, traveling overland with horses and wagon. We were 2 days on the way with no road to direct us save the deer trails and buffalo wallows. We traveled by compass. At night, the men built bonfires and sat around them, firing guns to keep the wild animals from coming near. When we got inside of Nicodemus, the men shouted, "There is Nicodemus." Being very sick, I hailed this news with gladness. I looked with all the eyes I had. "Where is Nicodemus? I don't see it." My husband pointed out various smokes coming out of the ground and said, "That is Nicodemus." The families lived in dugouts. The scenery to me was not at all inviting, and I began to cry. By the mid-1880s, Nicodemus was a thriving community with many farms and businesses, complete with its own newspaper and schoolhouse, along with Baptist, Free Methodist, and African Methodist Episcopal churches. However, its success was short-lived because the region's climate did not prove reliable for long-term community sustainability. Nicodemus was doomed when the Missouri Pacific, the Santa Fe, and the Union Pacific Railroads bypassed the town. The town fell into steady decline by the end of the 1880s. Ultimately, Nicodemus could not survive without some connection to the larger Western infrastructure. Despite the hardships, the opportunity for self-determination on the frontier during the post-Reconstruction period appealed to many African American migrants when stacked against the ordeal of mob violence in the Jim Crow South. According to historian Quintard Taylor, when a reporter for the St. Louis Globe asked a woman if she would return to the South, she replied, "What? Go back? I'd sooner starve here."
Colonialism and slavery. After colonies were established in North America, colonists were subject to the laws and customs of England. In their essay Situating Colonialism, Race, and Punishment, Professors Jita Chowdhury and Mark Beeman explain how the development of slavery in the North American colonies, and later in the early United States, became dependent on the passage of discriminatory laws that specifically targeted people of African descent. They detail how, although the concept of discrimination based on ethnic or social groups dates back to antiquity, the idea that race was entirely based on skin tone and physical features evolved alongside the emergence of chattel slavery. Then the ideal was solidified with the emergence of scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Chowdhury and Beeman go on to note that although some of the original people of African descent who entered the English colonies came as indentured servants and were eventually set free, similar to English indentured servants, this quickly changed when colonists turned to chattel slavery as a source of consistent, exploited, and unpaid labor. They write, "In other words, slavery seems to have evolved, in part, as a punishment reserved for Africans originally indentured. English indentured servants, presumably protected by English rights and the Christianity they shared with their masters, avoided such punishment. From the 1640s through the 1660s, with the principle of lifelong involuntary servitude established for Africans in colonial America, individual colonies began enacting legislation declaring Negroes sent to the colonies and their offspring slaves for life. In short, slavery in British colonial America became a punishment for being black." With this important distinction, colonial America created the system of chattel slavery that sentenced black people to perpetual servitude. Slavery created an explicit relationship between race and the law from the earliest foundations of American society. And this new legal category meant that new forms of punishment and torture were invented to accommodate this shift in who could be considered a full person under the law. Soon, laws and colonial codes were written to regulate the control and punishment of the enslaved. Although slavery was not the first instance of race being tied to laws in the new colonies, the colonization of land in North America was based on the assumption that Native Americans did not have rights to the land they had inhabited long before settler colonialism declared North America as uninhabited. Therefore, laws that allowed white settlers to displace and physically harm Native Americans also established an early relationship between race and the law in colonial America. While most punishment was left up to slave owners and could include torture, brutal beatings, rape, and other inhumane cruelties, more serious punishment, such as execution, was sometimes left up to the discretion of judges for supposed offenses that occurred away from the plantation. But whether it was being dealt by overseers and owners or by the state, the result was a system of exploitation and legally supported subjugation that left black subjects almost entirely outside of the protections of the law. This system remained firmly in place in parts of the United States until 1865, with the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But even these newly won freedoms could not guarantee the continuation of legal and extra-legal methods of racial and social control. Following the close of the Civil War in 1865, the U.S. entered into a period known as Reconstruction, which lasted until the 1870s. Although there were some legal and societal victories for black subjects during this time, they were swiftly overturned and replaced by Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow introduced a set of laws that systematically stripped black citizens of their rights while also relegating them to inferior, separate but equal public facilities like schools, washrooms, and sections of the bus, among other indignities. Black citizens were denied access to basic rights like voting, while also suffering under the weight of racial terror imposed by groups like the KKK and other white supremacists who organized lynchings and other forms of racialized violence. Jim Crow laws effectively relegated black subjects to second-class citizenship based on a racialized caste system where white citizens were privileged above all others. This system of disenfranchisement was also supported by methods of financial control like sharecropping, which effectively reinstated the financial inequity of slavery through unfair practices. And systems like convict leasing guaranteed that black people would be returned to a system almost identical to slavery in everything but name. With convict leasing, private businesses could rent the labor of prisoners to complete tasks. The businesses would pay the state, and the prisoners would be forced to perform labor for free. As a result, Southern states started incarcerating newly emancipated black citizens at a higher rate, for anything from petty theft to vagrancy to other vaguely defined laws. This practice lasted from the late 19th century into the early 20th century.
Over the course of the 18th century, slavery grew more important in the American economy. More enslaved Africans were imported into the colonies than free European migrants came over during the 18th century. And this is a period that's known as the age of the American Revolution, all these ideas of freedom and democracy. But slavery was steadily growing during this time period.
UNC Charlotte professor of history Christopher Cameron says enslaved African Americans brought with them unique farming skills such as pottery, basket weaving, and metalworking. But their knowledge in the cultivation of a certain cash crop proved invaluable.
African knowledges of rice cultivation is really what helped to make that the staple crop of South Carolina and Georgia.
By the time of the American Civil War, there were an estimated 4 million enslaved people, including Wally Cathcart's ancestors. Right as the war was winding down, there was a push to give the now freedmen 40 acres of land and a mule.
You fast forward to Sherman's March, which started in late 1864. When he got to Savannah in early 1865, he and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met with a group of black leaders in Savannah. They made it very clear that for them, freedom meant land ownership. And that's where you get Special Field Order 15, where he would set aside 40 acres for any family that wanted to work it and provide them with mules that the Army could no longer use. So this was in January of 1865. Within 5 months or so, roughly 40,000 freed people had been settled on what came to be called Sherman's Land.
But that program would be short-lived.
President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he revoked that order in the summer of 1865, just as it was really getting going, and then uses the Army to kick the free people off of it, right? So they'd been given the land by an Army general, and then the Army then comes and takes them off of the land.
Without an enslaved workforce to work the cotton fields and other crops, landowners turned to sharecropping.
It was seen as, something of a compromise by the freed people, right? They wanted their own land, they wanted independence and autonomy. If they couldn't get their own land, this was the next best thing, because what they would do is they would rent a parcel of land from the white owner of the land, and they would farm it, right? They'd be given horses, a mule, farm utensils, they would farm it, and then at the end of the year, they would divide up the crop 50-50.
During my childhood, I guess you say the colloquial expression by African American was harvest. Are you working on harvest? That's half. The landowner provided the land, the dwelling, the house, and whatever material was needed. The tenant, the sharecropper, he provided the labor. But during the course of the year, you had to get whatever substance that you needed from, the landowner. Whatever that was added on a list, and whatever it tabbed up to be at the end of the cotton crop season was deducted from your half. Most of the time, it took all of what you made and then more. It continued year after year. And if you know anything about sharecropping, I call it just a graded down version of slavery because it was a perpetual debt.
The sharecropping system and systemic racism kept many black farmers and their families from owning land.
Because, the white the planters, didn't want them to own land because that would have taken them away from their sharecropping that depended on. So they were not going to make land easily available for the African American at that time.
The Homestead Act is a testament to the complexities of American history. It represents hope and hardship, opportunity and injustice, dreams fulfilled and dreams shattered. As we reflect on this pivotal chapter, we are reminded that progress often comes at a price, and that the lessons of the past can guide us toward a more equitable future.